And thank you, Lydia. Just that was a good time to start that. So the aim of Rights in Action is a project that we've been doing for just over 3 years now, is to raise awareness of economic, social and cultural rights, and to support communities to add human rights to their collective power, and as well to support participatory action research, which is supporting people from groups that are furthest removed from their rights, to raise issues around what they're experiencing in relation to inequality. So we have done this work through three different work streams as part of Rights in Action. So we brought together community organisations and Know Your Rights workshops, which some of you today might have participated in, and they have been really instrumental to sharing like what are economic, social, cultural rights and how they can be used as a tool in the fight against poverty. Secondly, we have been supporting groups of action learning sets, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And here we've called them learning groups, to create opportunities for community organisations to share experiences, learn and identify changes that they can make. And lastly, we've also been conducting and supporting rather participatory action research projects. So working with community researchers on a range of different projects to generate learning on how human rights intersect with inequality, and to undertake action as well. So there's reports that we have up on our website. We have a Rights in Action page which shares some of the findings from the participatory action research projects we have been supporting over the last few years. So I do encourage you to look at those as well. So moving on, I've touched on this a little bit already, but why we as a project and as Poverty Alliance, we think taking a human rights based approach to tackling poverty matters and what difference it can make. So human rights are the government's responsibilities towards us. They place our concerns within a framework of human rights. So we're not asking for charity, we're asking for the government to fulfil the promises they have made to us. So the government and other key state organisations are duty bearers who are responsible for the realisation and accountability around human rights of people living in poverty. So human rights also centre dignity for people who are living in poverty. So we all have rights regardless of our situation, but human rights emphasise that it's universal, and that the state has a role in ensuring that we are all able to access our rights and live a dignified life. So only the state has human rights obligations. So private actors also have public duties, but taking a human rights-based approach to poverty places responsibility on poverty to the state rather than people experiencing poverty themselves. And at Poverty Alliance, we believe that people with experience of poverty need to be part of the solutions to poverty as well. So taking a human rights-based approach is really important because it is centering people's own lived experience and having a say in the issues that matter to them and that impact on them. So Lydia's going to now talk a bit more about the process of taking a human rights-based approach that has been a core part of our work in Rights in Action. So I'll pass over to Lydia.
Thank you, Laura. So the Scottish Human Rights Commission has very helpfully developed the panel principles to kind of guide organisations in embedding a human rights-based approach. And these were principles that we explored with the Action Learning Set, and also that we have been kind of raising awareness of throughout Rights in Action. So these are participation, ensuring that people have a say in the issues that impact their rights, and that this participation should be meaningful, it should be accessible, accountability, so ensuring there is remedy when things go wrong. And if a public body is taking a human rights-based approach, this means that they need to remedy the rights breaches that may have happened and ensure that they don't happen again. But if we're thinking about third sector organizations, this can be supporting communities to name and claim their rights, in ensuring that we are pursuing accountability for human rights breaches from our public bodies. Non-discrimination and equality, which in a human rights context also means prioritizing those who are furthest away from their rights when we're thinking about designing projects or decision-making, empowerment, making sure people know that they have human rights and supporting them to name and claim them where possible, and legality, so grounding our approaches in internationally recognized human rights and understanding human rights as legal underpinnings of our work. So throughout this project, we used a methodology called action learning to plan action to tackle poverty and to analyze poverty using a human rights lens. So I think next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. So we received training from the Action Learning Associates at the beginning of the project. And although it was the project's team's first time using Action Learning as a methodology, it wasn't Poverty Alliance's first time using this methodology to take action on complex problems. So Action Learning is a participatory, action-focused methodology that brings together peers to support them to learn in a challenging but supportive environment. It's a relatively fixed methodology that brings together a group of kind of usually 7 to 10 people from different organizations, or sometimes the same organizations, but different in our work. And at each set, someone talks through a real world issue that they're facing. And they're supported by other set members who ask open, inquiring, and often challenging questions to support them to come to a series of actions that they commit to try to advance. And at each following meeting of the group, you have to report back on the actions that you've taken, and that kind of builds some accountability into the process. So the first time that we used Action Learning was through our Menu for Change project, and the learning from this project influenced Rights in Action. So Menu for Change was delivered in partnership with Oxfam Scotland, Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland and Nourish, and it aims to reduce the need for emergency food aid by improving local responses to food insecurity. So throughout this project, we brought together 3 action learning sets in 3 local authority areas and included members from different agencies and organizations that provided financial advice in a crisis or sometimes referrals to emergency food aid. So these sets were cross-sectoral, multi-level, and members were recruited to bring kind of different knowledge to the table. And this project really highlighted that action learning can work as a methodology to think about systems change and to think about complex systems. And something that was that came through an evaluation from this project has also come through an evaluation for the next 2 stages of Rights in Action, has been the importance of that solution-focused time that an action learning set can provide. The only kind of, it's not really a downside, but it was something that was raised, was sometimes set members had challenges in implementing actions that they'd identified, and this could be to do with their role in the organization. So often those who are best placed to think about solutions, who are delivering frontline services, don't necessarily have the authority to implement them. And also kind of the boundaries on what action can be taken when there isn't every stakeholder in the room. And this is something that we thought about when we were thinking about recruitment for the next stage of, for our next action learning project. And so as a result, we recruited directors or project coordinators from small community-based organizations, because we wanted to think about how can we ensure that the project leads to practice change across organizations or across projects. Something that Menu for Change did that we then moved forward into Rights in Action was to take a step away from having a neutral facilitator. So action learning traditionally was a professional development methodology. And obviously in Menu for Change, we had a clear goal, which was trying to reduce the need for emergency food aid. And in Rights in Action, we have a clear goal that is around kind of taking a human rights-based approach to poverty. And in Rights in Action, the non-neutral facilitation looked like explicitly trying to bring human rights into the process. And in the first set, we did this by sticking questions about human rights all over the walls and making sure that we were kind of coming back to what we'd learned in the training. However, our evaluation from the first action learning set suggested that the first action learning set that we did in Rights in Action suggested that people actually had an appetite for a bit more human rights learning, about it being more specific and explicit in our linkages that we were making to human rights throughout the project, and that actually they one set member said that maybe they'd have liked us to be even less of a neutral facilitator and really be consistent and explicit in pulling out those human rights linkages. And that was something that we took forward into the next stage of the project that the report that we're launching today is written about. So something that has been consistent throughout them is that the peer-to-peer learning has been seen as transformative, that it's been seen as supporting both well-being and practice change, and that's something that we're seeing throughout the project. So what did we do differently in our rural action learning set, the one that the report that we're publishing today is about? So obviously we recruited predominantly rural organisations, and that was a major difference, and we saw different issues coming to the fore as a result of that. And we also created more time in our initial human rights training for organisations to map their work onto internationally recognised human rights. We also created a list of reflective questions about the principles of taking a human rights-based approach and gave people time to reflect on their own work alone. And I'm smiling because I felt a little bit like a teacher when I gave people that activity. But we gave them time to reflect on these alone, to answer these questions so that they had a really strong foundation to build upon as we went through the later stages of the project. And I think that's reflected in the kind of case studies and the things that set members explored throughout the project. And then as we went through this action learning set, we did a review on how people thought the process was going, and they had an appetite for even more learning experiences, and they wanted a deeper learning component. They wanted presentations on key rights issues, updates of what was happening in the policy area and in the wider sector. And it was obviously an interesting time with the consultation on the Human Rights Bill and then the UNCRC coming into force. And they were interested in having an additional learning component as part of the project. And this was something that people found really valuable, and it was reflected in the evaluation that they found this really valuable. And this has shaped the next phase of the project that I'm just doing the evaluation interviews for now. So that should be written up at the end of March, maybe beginning of April, where we mapped each set meeting, so each of the groups meeting, to a panel principle, and then had an additional learning component that's been available for all of our members in the shape of webinars on the panel principles. And I'll pass back over to Laura.
Thanks, Lydia. So I'm now going to share some of the issues that came up during our work with the 6 rural organisations. So there's some more detail in the report that we will share afterwards, after the webinar today. So to give you some context, we worked with 6 organisations who were in remote, rural and communities, or in remote island communities as well. So the community organisations varied in terms of groups that they supported, but they all had very common challenges, which we have detailed in the report. So some of the challenges felt across the 6 community organisations were around gaps in service provision from the council. So welfare rights advice in particular came up. So there's examples of some of the community orgs having to fill the gaps in those spaces where there wasn't services being provided by the local authority or in the area. There's also issues around lack of transport, and that was the focus of one of the action learning sets. And this specific community organisation had really had to plug the gaps in terms of providing and supporting transport of marginalised groups in their local community. One of the really common key issues that came up was around higher levels of poverty-related stigma in rural areas. So the group all reflected on this as a challenge in terms of people accessing the support that they have in the local community. So they talked about people feeling embarrassed to access the services, and you'll see when we go on to share some more detail about what the action learning sets involved, that this was actually something that there was a lot of shared learning around how the community orgs could use human rights language and the way they describe their services to kind of address that poverty related stigma that was preventing people from accessing support. And another key common issue for the 6 community orgs involved was challenges working with stretched local authorities. So there's quite a few examples amongst the action learning sets of there not being enough services or support provided by local authorities, or also a lack of kind of awareness within the local council of the issues that we're facing in a remote area. So this was something that we also were able to kind of come together with the groups and reflect on like what actions could be taken to address that as well. So while these were some of the common issues that came up during the action learning sets, there was also a range of other issues that organisations were facing within their own teams or organisation, such as how to recruit new trustees in quite a remote local area that had the expertise that were needed to build the community organisation. And it was also a great opportunity for some of the community orgs to talk about challenges they'd had around setting up a new project. So there were some people that were setting up kind of new community groups, and they were able to learn from more experienced participants in the action learning set as well. So the next slide that I'm going to share is a video that we created which shares some of the key issues that came up in the action learning sets and what some of the actions were and what some of the outcomes were for a few of the community orgs that have been part of this project. So we'll be sharing this, we'll be able to share this recording afterwards, but this really gives a sense of what the action learning set outcomes were for some of the people who took part. And then we'll move on to kind of share a bit about what some of the overall benefits have been as well. So I will, hopefully all the tech works, and if Lydia, you can give me a thumbs up, that would be great.
Human rights are not just ideals. They can be the foundation for action, empowerment and change. As a result of this project, organisations from across Scotland came together to analyse and plan action to tackle poverty using a human rights lens. A key impact of the project was organisations embedding human rights into their work. In June of 2023, 6 organisations came together in Aberdeen for a residential. During this time, we undertook human rights training, and participants spent time mapping their work onto internationally recognised human rights. We learnt about the action learning methodology and held our first action learning sets. We then went on to meet monthly online for 12 months. Each action learning set was guided by members, tackling the real life issues they identified as important to their organisation. One of the key issues explored by a set member was how to move beyond making rights-based decisions internally to becoming human rights defenders. The SET member recognised that in their role they had the power to influence policy, challenge unfair decisions and bring human rights language into the public arena for their remote island community. This SET member faced the challenge of making change to local systems without having a dedicated communications or campaigns officer in their organisation. They were initially adamant that they were not a campaigning organisation, but through questions asked by the other SET members, the presenter experienced a light bulb moment. They were already campaigners, advocating for the community they worked with at strategic meetings. Throughout the project, they explored tools to embed human rights throughout their work, wrote human rights into job descriptions, centred dignity and respect when engaging with duty bearers, and used human rights language to challenge discrimination against disabled people, something which they found to be effective. Another key issue brought to the group by a SET member was tackling the stigma and shame preventing the most marginalised in a rural remote community accessing the support offered by the organisation's poverty alleviation projects. Through discussions, SET members explored ways to light the fire in their community, changing perceptions and raising awareness of poverty as a human rights issue. They amended their communications, reached out to organisations that worked with communities they historically had struggled to engage, and secured funding for a digital drop-in, which helped them to engage with the wider community. Throughout the project, they kept a vital community space open using rights-based advocacy, and adapted their crisis grant project to use a human rights approach, including the framing of the form. At the end of the project, the SET member noted that there had been a shift in how the community saw the organisation, with the SET member highlighting that the community was now viewing them far more sympathetically. Organisations involved took steps like bringing staff together for human rights training, using the panel principles, and reviewing their organisational policies to embed human rights. But what were the other results of learning about human rights and starting to embed them into their work? Facing issues like inequitable service provision and the rollback of rural services, SET members gained confidence in using human rights language and advocating for their communities. Throughout the project, SET members advocated for libraries to remain open, pushed back against punitive responses to antisocial behaviour, and advocated for equal access to services. Young people were empowered to meet with and challenge politicians directly. SET members also gained confidence in articulating why their work was needed, and one SET member credited involvement with the process for receiving long-term funding for her post. Meaningful participation in the decisions that impact human rights is a key part of taking a human rights-based approach. Some organisations introduce new structures, like a co-produced youth forum, ensuring young people, especially those furthest from their rights, had a voice in shaping their communities. Young people identified their own roles, took part in projects, attended board meetings, and even met with ministers. Beyond the changes in practice, this project built a supportive peer network. The diversity of experience among members was a strength, influencing the direction and impact of the work. SET members credited the group in giving them the strength to keep going when things were hard. The relationships and connections made throughout this process allowed SET members to take bolder action to advance human rights.
Thank you, Laura. So we've done the project, well, we've done 2 phases of this work stream now, and I thought it would be interesting to think about what have been the similarities between them. So both sets reported increased confidence for participants as a key outcome for them, as well as increased confidence to challenge local decision makers and duty bearers. However, in the second set, in the evaluation interviews, people spoke about particularly finding the language of human rights helpful to do this, and cited being able to use the language as human rights as an important outcome. I think that this is due to that additional kind of learning component we had as part of the process, and particularly the 2.5 days that we spent together at the beginning of the process in the residential in Aberdeen. Both sets found engaging with human rights frameworks helpful and thought that taking part in the set had supported them to advance economic, social, and cultural rights. And both groups found the peer support deeply beneficial. And what was interesting is both sets had people in their evaluation discuss how isolating it can be to be a leader of a third sector community organisation, but for different reasons. Particularly in rural areas, it was to do with the kind of physical isolation of it as well, and how helpful it had been to have a kind of space where there was peer support offered and there was kind of collaborative working. So interestingly, both groups, so both the urban and the predominantly rural cohort, had set members that credited the process with securing longer term funding for their post. And both groups had sets that focused on governance structures. And I think what's a really important outcome for us is that all set members that took part in evaluation interviews reported that they were better able to integrate human rights and intersectional approaches into their work as a result of taking part of the set. Set members reported increased confidence engaging with marginalized groups, but in our kind of discussions with rural organizations, we spoke about how those communities' marginalization can look different, communities can be more homogenous, and people spoke about the utility of being able to talk about people who are furthest from their rights. And I'll pass back to Laura.
So, apologies, the slides, you can't see the text at the bottom there, but to share what some of the key learning for us has been. So Lydia shared at the beginning that we've used action learning now in quite a few projects at Poverty Alliance, and in this project with rural orgs, there were so many benefits, as Lydia's already shared, in terms of bringing a space together where people could share common issues and work through those together. So face-to-face working, though, is really important. And one of the challenges that we faced was around bringing the group together face-to-face. So after the initial residential that we had over a few days, where people were able to build those relationships face-to-face, we then went on to have the meetings online. And whilst we really wanted to bring everyone back together, it proved challenging due to a range of issues, including a lack of ferries. So just trying to get the transport and make the practicalities around that to bring everyone together. And in the evaluation interviews that we conducted at the end, most of the participants in the project reflected that there would have been benefits for them to have been able to meet again at least once or twice, so at a middle point in the project and again at the end. So what we would share, though, overall is that action learning partnered with human rights education can lead, as demonstrated in the video we just shared and also in the report that we published today, can lead to really positive outcomes for organisations and therefore for the communities that they support. So a reflection for me is that whilst action learning might be quite an intense process and require quite a lot of time for people to fully be able to take part in the process of action learning, the benefits far outweighed the time that they'd had to allocate in their busy work schedules to be able to fully participate. So with the learning that we had taken from the first action learning set and the changes that we made that Lydia shared earlier in terms of providing kind of questions to prompt people around thinking about human rights during the action learning set process was also really beneficial and ensured that organisations were able to take a rights-based approach and felt empowered as well through that process. And in terms of working in rural and remote rural areas as well, just to share as well our reflections around, as national organisations, how important that is for us, but the obvious challenges there are around doing that, and important to think about ensuring that people in rural areas have got the same ways to participate as people living in the more central belt of Scotland as well. So overall, yeah, we're delighted to share the findings from this research, and we have quite a bit of time available for Q&A. So we have a Q&A box that you can share questions, so please do ask us anything about the research and the approach that we've used, and I will stop screen sharing at the moment. So
I'm going to suggest that we start with an easy one, Laura. So there's a question that's been submitted that says, what are you proudest of from this work? And I was thinking, while I was listening to Laura talk about, I am proudest of the fact that we were able to create a space where people could address kind of sticky issues that they were facing in their day-to-day, and that space was so useful, and then also had the outcome that we were hoping for in supporting organisations to kind of analyse and plan action to address poverty using a human rights-based approach. But I also think that a big part of that is to do with how willing and open and game the orgs that were involved were, and how much they embraced the process. So I don't think that I don't think I can take full credit for the thing that has made me proudest, and it's been a really helpful methodology to build that trust and to kind of create a space where you can do that, and we found that as we move into the kind of next phase of that project, the methodology is having a similar effect as well. So I think that's been really positive.
I could add to that, but I feel like I would say the same thing. It was very much a collective experience where, yeah, there was just really strong relationships, and everybody was really committed to their participation, and it created a really kind of open, trusting space as well. So yeah, I think that was key to it being really successful. So there's other really great questions. The question there, Lydia, about what would you say that Poverty Alliance have learned from working with more rural organisations? I'm happy to kick off, but I think Lydia was very instrumental to this project and the recruitment of the community orgs that ended up taking part, who also then became members of the Poverty Alliance. And as we mentioned in the presentation, we've got real insights into what remote rural organisations were facing, and that there's some very specific challenges for them around the lack of public services in rural areas in particular, and how in particular large local authorities, there's clear gaps in provision there, in third sector and community orgs are really having to plug those gaps, and that the rural organisations have to be so adaptable and provide a whole range of support as well. It's amazing how much they were able to do with often quite small teams as well, and also working with volunteers in the local community. I don't know if there's anything specifically that you want to reflect on, Lydia.
I think that, so we have a whole host of work now that is working with in rural Scotland, and so we have this project, and then we have our Taking Action on Rural Poverty project. We also published a report for the CPG on poverty that we provide secretariat support for on rural poverty. And one thing that I think I found interesting as I've been looking across the work is how disparate places are facing similar issues. across Scotland, as we see kind of community organisations that through this phase of rights in action were talking about people not being able to afford essentials or being marginalised by poverty, but in areas that, if you look at their SIMD rating, look like they're pretty affluent. And I think that having that kind of up close look at how community orgs are working really kind of hammered that home to us. And I know my colleagues across the Taking Action on Rural Poverty team and the policy team are working on that regularly now. And I think it's been, really interesting to get that up close look of how those dynamics play out in rural settings. I think also from a personal perspective, the additional organizational time and stress that is associated with ferries and their kind of unreliability really kind of brought home a point that we've reflected in our kind of wider work around how difficult it can be to access services, to access the mainland, operating in, like, if you're living in rural Scotland. So there's a question in the chat that said, this is quite a hard one, so I don't know why I'm going for this one, but how can these organisations push for the rural uplift in funding that is needed to make an impact in rural Scotland? Can human rights budgeting play a part here? So that's a huge question, and it speaks to some of the work that we've undertaken, or some of the recommendations that we've made around rural poverty in the inquiry that we did for CPG, and also through Taking Action on Rural Poverty, and just thinking about how it's significantly more expensive to operate in a rural area, to live in a rural area, like 15 to 30% more expensive, and that's not reflected currently in Scottish Government policy. And I think that there is, so I'm obviously going to do a Poverty Alliance sell here and say, add your voice to the anti-poverty movement. One thing that we're really advocating for is that we need to take kind of twin approach of embedding an anti-poverty lens into rural policy, even if it looks like in rural areas there is a lower rate of poverty, because current poverty measures don't reflect that increased cost of living, but also that there needs to be a rural lens in Scottish policy making to make sure that we are factoring in those uplifts. And in terms of human rights budgeting, so human rights budgeting is about ensuring that resources are, the maximum available resources are distributed in a way that ensure people can access their human rights, with a focus on ensuring people can access the minimum level of each human right that's been deemed necessary for a dignified life. And the recent report by Scottish Human Rights Commission strongly states that in many areas across the Highlands and Islands, Scottish Government are not meeting their minimum core obligations in terms of thinking about access to food or housing. And so taking a human rights based approach to budgeting would ensure that you are prioritising on meeting those needs. And so the thing that is so you're measuring kind of success by the outcome, that people can access those core human rights. And also that budgeting process needs to involve participation, it needs to be transparent. And by ensuring that it's kind of focused on the outcome and the needs-based, then that would necessitate having to build in a rural uplift. I don't know why I chose probably the hardest question to answer there, but Laura, go for it.
Well,
I'll let you.
I am very happy that you did, and you answered it, I thought, very well. So there's some other questions around about somebody asking, Liz Richardson, they're asking what kind of groups took part, which rural remote areas were represented. So I guess that's more, specific question about participation. And we have shared a little bit about context in terms of being, if they were remote, rural, but we haven't shared anything further in terms of the local authorities, because they've been anonymised as part of this process, and that's part of doing the action learning set, that you have this kind of safe space to share any issues that you're working on. So yeah, we're not able to give more detail in terms of the specific local authorities that they were in. In terms of kinds of groups that took part, yeah, we could definitely say a little bit in relation to that. So some of the community orgs were just providing like universal support for anyone in their community. So I would say half of them, but the others had maybe a specific focus around a particular group. So there was an organisation who was working with young people in their local community, and an organisation that was working with carers and disabled people. But on the whole, the organisations were the only organisation in quite a big area, so they were kind of, yeah, they offered a whole range of support to anybody in the community. So I hope that answers that question.
There is a question in the chat that says, do you see any difference in willingness or success in taking human rights-based approaches between rural and urban organisations? So I think that's an interesting question, and one that's quite hard to answer in relation to this project, because our ways of working were very different, building on the learning from the previous action learning set, where people had said, actually, we want more human rights education, more kind of explicit linkages to human rights. We want you to be even less neutral as a non-neutral facilitator. And so I think that resulted in a slightly different kind of issues being addressed by the set members. But in terms of willingness, I think the fact that came through in the evaluation, that they wanted more of it, suggests that the willingness is there. And something that I've seen happen actually as I'm watching some of the previous urban action learning set members continue their work is I'm seeing the impacts of being involved in the action learning sets. I'm having people feedback that previous set members are raising human rights in meetings or in feedback about reports, and so we're seeing that kind of long-term learning that's happening outside of the set as well. And so I think it's quite hard to kind of to compare the two. Something that I think is interesting, and one of the conversations I had is around a rural set member talking about kind of difficulties about using human rights in public facing comms in places where there is no state presence. And so it's very hard to be like, the state should be doing this, where the state is not present in providing services in your small community. And that being something that came out from the rural set that didn't come up in the urban set because of there just being a greater concentration of services, and also like the actual existence of state services in the area. And so that was an interesting thing to kind of discuss. But then that organization still found like a great utility in taking a human rights-based approach. And so I think that was an interesting difference, and also, yeah, reflects kind of some of the conversations that I've heard members of the commission that have been doing work in Highland and Island areas talk about, of kind of a lack of awareness of human rights and like a lack of services in many areas.
We kind of seem to be doing this, you answer one, I answer another. So there's about 4 questions or so left. So but still obviously feel free to add anything else, and if we don't get to it, we can get back to you afterwards. I was just looking at another question that's kind of related to the previous one. So are there lessons about rural poverty for Central Belt local authorities, with both towns and rural areas? So yeah, that's a good question. I think a common theme that came up was around poverty stigma and the barriers that people can face to accessing support. And those of you that in the civil society third sector will already be aware of that, I know. And I think that there was two action learning sets that focused very much on that and how you can use human rights language to make like their organisation feel like it was more kind of universal and reduce that stigma that they might feel accessing support from a public service. So I think there's a lot of learning about how organisations in both remote rural and accessible rural and in more urban areas can share like their experiences of working with communities and reducing poverty stigma with public services and local authorities where that might be preventing people accessing the support that they are entitled to as well. There's probably loads we could say on that, but that was just something I was reflecting on that came out of the action learning set. Is there anything around that you want to add, Lydia?
I was just thinking about how like rural experiences are very different than urban and town experiences, and making sure that if you are doing kind of participation work that it's capturing those as well. And also just kind of, yeah, I'm thinking about, I mean, one thing that I keep thinking about is just issues of accessibility and how throughout our work in rural communities, like issues around lack of public transport is like really, really kind of clear, and just, yeah, being conscious of that additional cost, but also the barrier that can face in terms of the barrier that can cause in terms of accessing services, even if you are in like a central belt area, but yeah, living somewhere that's rural, and how expensive that can be, but also like prohibitive in terms of getting to appointments. And previous work we've done with a local authority that served a rural area, one of the things that they were talking about was like planning their healthcare appointments for people who they knew were living on a low income around when the bus schedule was, so people weren't having to take their entire day out. And so I think there's lots of learning across our work that's outside of this project as well about things that can be put in place to kind of better engage with and support people who are living on a low income.
I was just looking at another question we have around whether particular aspects of human rights, of the human rights framework, people found it easier or harder to engage with. I feel like this is probably more a question for you, Lydia, particularly because of your involvement in the third action learning set we've been doing, which has been looking at different parts of the panel principles in each session. I, in terms of the panel principles, I think they are a really useful tool for people to engage with and quite straightforward. And I think the learning from the first action learning set in terms of starting out with people reflecting on what they're currently already doing around human rights and having training on human rights as well embedded throughout the year as well. So anything that came up, so cultural, right to cultural life came up quite a few times. So then Lydia did a session specifically on that as well. So in terms of the panel principles, I think they were quite like easy for organisations to kind of see that related to their work. But there's probably loads more that Lydia could reflect on around that. So
one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking was some feedback that we got after the initial human rights training with this cohort and this action learning set, was a set member being like, I can't believe I didn't know this. Like, I'm working in this space and I didn't know this. And I think that people understanding how it relates to their work and also kind of exploring like the utility of human rights was something that people found quite interesting. I think kind of feedback that I had from the previous set was often people, oh, my laptop is frozen. Okay, I'm back. Was people struggling with the kind of lack of rights realization in communities, and also seeing these kind of legal entitlements at the international level where there was kind of discussion around them, and there's still kind of a delayed human rights bill about them being brought into domestic law, so we could then, there'd be judiciable, God, I hate that word, in Scottish courts, and the kind of tension between seeing a Scotland where local authorities can't meet their legal requirements around housing, and then having these further legal requirements, and realizing that there's needs to be a significant step change in the way we think about how we're funding services if we're going to kind of meet our human rights. And I think that navigating that tension with the first group was interesting and had a really kind of useful discussion about how human rights need to be resourced as well as part of that. So that was an interesting bit of the framework that came out a lot in the first session. And I think that's to do with the nature of the organizations as well, and having orgs that work really closely on housing in that setting. But in the second one, I think that something that I think that people kind of struggled with a bit in the first one that we made really clear on the second one was thinking about human rights throughout your work as someone in the third sector is kind of a step change in the way that you're thinking and the way that you're working. Like, your work might be advancing human rights, but you might not be thinking about it in terms of that. And you might not be thinking that you have the tools of human rights available to you. And so that was something we were really conscious to reinforce throughout the second set. And some of the reflections were around how being immersed in the language and also immersed in examples of good practice meant that people were kind of learning. I think the quote was like, learning without really realizing that you're learning, and feeling that then they were empowered to take that forward because they'd had that immersive learning experience. And so I think that was just like, it's not necessarily that the framework was seen as more accessible, it's that we were like really on it in terms of really emphasizing the kind of learning component of the process. And I think it's also worth mentioning that even with the first set, where we didn't have as comprehensive learning package, I mean, there still was training and there still was kind of ongoing reflection. The organisation still reflected that they understood their work to be human rights work, and they understood that the human rights frameworks were there for them as well in their evaluation. So I think that that still came through, but I think it was more strongly in the second set because of that increased learning component.
We've just got a few minutes left and still got some good questions. So maybe if we pick out one of those just to very quickly answer, and then we can talk about next steps, but we can respond to the other questions when we share the recording afterwards. Does that sound okay, Lydia? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Is there any question that you're burning to just give a response to?
So there's one that I can see that says, what kinds of support do you think rural human rights defenders need most? And I can't answer that because I'm not a rural human rights defender, but I will say that one thing that really came through in the project was the importance of that confidential peer support space. And people reflected that it kind of gave them the strength to keep going when things are really tough. It also gave them a group of people to bounce ideas off. And it also kind of, created a place to affirm that they were doing the right thing. And I think that was really helpful. But in terms of answering that more broadly, I don't think I can, as not a rural human rights defender, but I think that would be like a key piece of learning from the project.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think just to add on from what Lydia said, a very obvious answer around like sustainability of funding for rural community orgs who are really providing such a critical source of like services and support for people, and often are like the only organisation there is in very remote areas. So yeah, just around sustainability of funding, which is often, I know, a key challenge for community orgs that are supporting people who are in poverty. So yeah, that takes us to 1 o'clock pretty well much. So in terms of next steps for the project, Lydia had mentioned before that she's just completed doing another action learning set with organisations who have a campaigning role in relation to tackling poverty in Scotland. So basically watch this space for the outputs from that work, and we will follow up after this to share the recording and answer some of the questions we didn't quite get to today. But please do feel free to get in touch with myself or Lydia, and our contact details are on the Poverty Alliance's website if you want to talk to us about Rights in Action at all. So thank you for joining us today.